Okay, welcome everybody to a it's an Elul topic, an Elul discussion, which usually the focus and idea theme is about growth. And so the title of the shiur is called a precursor to Teshuvah, which means that there are certain steps that are necessary for us to understand before we engage the actual process of Teshuvah. There are certain fundamental aspects, and I think specifically in our time, in history, I think it's very relevant for us to point out the historical context and the historical precedent that would require us to now think about our lives about growing. So what's the historical imperative to do Teshuvah? When I say historical imperative, I say that, yeah, we know anytime a person does something wrong, you have a requirement that you have to reflect on what you did and try to commit to be better. Especially in this time of the year. We talk about Elul, we talk about the time where a person now really has to focus on it because there's a designated time period. But aside from that, there's a historical imperative for us to think about our lives because of the time and place that we exist within the history of mankind. And that's what I want to focus on at the beginning of this discussion. So just to start, so the Zohar says something very interesting, and I'll read it to you and I'll translate it. Says Rabbi Eliezer Omer, he says the following: Kol hagaliyot shegalta Knesset Yisrael, all of the exiles that the Jewish people were exiled into, Natan LaKadosh Baruch Hu zman v'ketz, each one of them God gave a specific time when it should end. Right? We know that they were exiled twice prior to this current exile, and we know that each one was given a specific time. That's what the Zohar says. B'nit'ara tamid b'teshuvah, and at that time there was a movement of Teshuvah, and the Jews were redeemed. However, he says, V'galut ha'acharon, the last exile, the one that we find ourselves in right now, ein lo ketz uzman. There is no set defined time when it has to happen. Ele hakol talui b'teshuvah. Rather, it is completely dependent on our teshuvah. Our, as in the Jewish people's response to certain circumstances in the world of the time, that's going to be the trigger, as the pasuk says, V'shavta ad Hashem Elokecha v'shamata b'kolo. You, Jewish people, must take the initiative and do Teshuvah. And just so you know that this is not just a Zohar, Zohars are very difficult to understand. The Rambam himself actually brings us down in his book of Halacha as a requirement in the time, at the end of time. And we'll talk about how do we know if we are in the end of time or not. You know, a lot of people try to, the end of the world type of fear factor. I don't want to do that. I want to really just analyze this from a really logical perspective. The Rambam says, he says, "Ukvar hevticha haTorah." The Torah itself has hevticha is promise. I went blank with the word. Promise. As it promised, right? Or yeah, that's right. It guaranteed shesof Yisrael asut teshuvah, that at the end of time the Jewish people will do teshuvah. Besof galutan, at the end of the exile. And at the end, they will be redeemed. Shene'amar, as the verse says, Yavo alecha kol edvarim. We see the verses of the Tochacha, which is in Parshat Kitavo, which is in Devarim. There will be a lot of calamities occurring to the Jewish people. V'shavta ad Hashem Elokecha. You Jewish people will do Teshuvah. V'shav Hashem Elokecha, and then God will redeem you in return. Says the Rambam in Halacha that there will be a specific time at the end of time where the Jewish people will have a responsibility to look at their ways as a whole, as a community, as a people, change their ways. God will see that, and in response, return the Jewish people. So the question is how do we know if we've now engaged in this time period, which we call the end of time? It's a little bit of a scary statement, but, so we know that the Jewish calendar, the historical calendar, is supposed to be 6,000 years long. Day one being from the day Adam was created. Day 6,000 will be what we say is the end of time. So there's a 6,000-year period which the mission of God in the world has to come to completion. We are currently in the year 5,774. 5,775, which would mean that there are 226 years left to the history of the world. Hopefully they'll come up with a drug and we could live that long, right? But hopefully it'll be before that. So we know that there's this time period. So now what exactly happens within this last time period? So the Chafetz Chaim, who was one of the greatest leaders in just the previous generation, he said himself, he wrote this, he said that in his time, he has witnessed a majority of the signs that the Talmud says will occur in the end of time as indicators that we have entered the ending of humanity. I don't mean ending of humanity, it could be like Armageddon. I mean that we are reaching the culmination of what human history had as its mission. And he says that in my time, I've seen most of those signs that the Talmud says they've already come to fruition. So if it was true in the times of the Chavetz Chaim, we who live just a little bit further into the future, all the more so. And this gets really interesting. So the Vilna Gaon, the Gra, who was arguably one of the greatest Jewish scholars, Kabbalists, anything you could imagine he made a prediction. He made a prediction based on the Torah. And he says like this. He says if you look at the last book of the Torah, Sefer Devarim, there are 10 parshiot in Sefer Devarim. Nitzavim and Vayelech are really considered one by many. So there's 10 parshiot in the end of time. And he says that those 10 parshiot in the end, in the last book of the Torah, each one of those books corresponds to a 100-year period in the last 6,000th year of human history. So we say human history is 6,000 years. If you take the last 1,000 years and you break that 1,000 years into 100-year compartments, he says each one of the parshiot of Sefer Devarim correspond to one of those 100 years. And says the Vilna Gaon, this was way before there was the atrocities that we could have ever imagined took place in the Holocaust. Says the Chavetz Chaim, he says there will be a time in the 700th year of the last 1,000, in the 700th year, which will correspond to the Parsha of Ki Tavo. And if you open Ki Tavo, we read it really quickly because it talks about very terrible things that will happen to the Jewish people. He says at that time there will be a very strong hand of God to push the people towards Teshuvah. And lo and behold, what did we find happen in the last generation? We had the Holocaust. And so, very much we're focused on that. We see that there's this corresponding. So there's a great writer. His name is Rav Alexander Mandelbaum. He's a big scholar and educator in Israel. So he takes this historical correlation one step further. And he says, well, if the Vilna Gaon said that there's this corresponding year of the 700 to Ki Tavo, what is the next stage of human history, which is exactly the one that we are now ushering in? We have now entered the 700th. The 800th year. So that was the 700th year. We are now in the 800th year. What takes place in the 800th year of human history? And he says like this. He says that the verse that the Rambam quotes and the Zohar quotes, that there will be a responsibility, aside for the individual responsibility to change, the historical imperative for the Jewish people to do Teshuvah. What parsha does the verse, Vishavda, and you will turn back to Hashem? Where is that found? It's found in the Parsha of Nitzavim, which exactly is the Parsha after Ki Tavo, which means we transition out of the calamities of a history of the Holocaust, and then we move into this Parsha of Teshuvah, which is exactly where we find ourselves today. This is the historical imperative for Teshuvah. And to take it even further, there was a Kabbalist by the name of Yitzchak Isaac Chaver. He was a great Kabbalist. He wrote a commentary on the Zohar. And he writes an interesting thing. I have the text here. I actually didn't keep one for myself. But I wanted to look inside because I don't want you to think I'm making up these psukim. This you will find in your local Torah. So he says if you look very closely at the verses in Parshas Nitzavim, which is the next stage, which is the historical point that we are in, he makes the following observations. I want to read the first two paragraphs because he says that they describe two aspects of this Teshuvah. We know that the Zohar says that human history, the Jewish people, will only be redeemed when they do Teshuvah. Say the rabbis, that Teshuvah can be motivated by two factors. They can be self-motivated, or they can be forced. And he says that you see it right in these parshiot. And I'll read it to you. It says, Va'ayaki yavo alech at the top. And it will be when it comes upon you, kol advarim ha'eleh, habracha va'klala, the blessings and the curses that just had happened to us in the previous generation, asher natati lefanecha, which I gave to you. And as a consequence, you proactively, v'hashevota elevavecha, you place this message in your heart. B'chol hagoyim, asher hadichacha Hashem elokecha shama, even when you're living amongst the non-Jewish world, which I had sent you there. Which means it's describing a time period. Well, there will be calamities, And the Jewish people will be spread out in the world, as we are today. V'shavda ad Hashem Elokecha, and you return to Hashem, v'shamata v'kola, and you listen to His words, k'chol asher anochi mitzvah b'cha hayom, ata ovincha ovinecha b'chol levavecha b'chol nafshecha. And then He says, v'shav Hashem Elokecha et shivotecha. He says, as a consequence of that individual recognition, God will redeem us. V'richamecha, and He will have mercy on us, v'shav v'kibatzcha michol ha'amim, and then He will return us to Israel. So He says the first process of Teshuvah recognition that will usher in what we call the time of Mashiach, the time of culmination of human history, is a self-motivated recognition that the Jews would have as a consequence of the difficult history that we've had in our past. That is stage one of Teshuvah. It says the next three verses, and what happens if we don't do that? V'im yehiyeh nidachacha b'ktzei hashamayim. But if this moment of ushering in of the Jewish people does not take place at that time, and the Jews will still be even further spread out, b'ktzei hashamayim, almost to the end of heavens, which means that they'll just be further lost in this world. Says God, Misham yikabetzcha Hashem Elokecha. Then God, out of His mercy, will gather the Jews back from this exile into Israel, without them having deserved it, without them having done the Teshuvah. They will have the zechus to go back into Israel pre-Teshuvah. Umisham yikachacha, and He will take you from there. Ve'yacha Hashem Elokecha la'aretz, and He will bring you to Israel. Asher yarshu chavotecha v'yarashta, and you will inherit it. And then He says, ve'yitivcha v'hirbacha me'avotecha, and He will give you much blessing and success in this land. He will bring you in before Teshuvah. He will make you very successful, and He will stop and wait to listen. Jews, do you see what I'm doing? Do you see what I'm giving you? Do you see the blessing? Do we see a flourishing Israel today like we've never seen before in history? Do we recognize that? And God says, I'm listening to see, will that motivate you to do the Teshuvah on your own? To recognize out of the goodness. And so says the next verse, but if we don't recognize it even then, Umal Hashem Elokecha et levavecha, then God will be forced to circumcise our hearts, to resensitize. Circumcision is when you cut off layers so you reach a more sensitive part of the human soul. And God says, I will be forced to circumcise that. Et levavecha ve'et lev zarecha, and the hearts of your children, le'ahava, to force you to love. Et Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavecha b'chol nafshecha le'man chayecha. And then when we come to the recognition through God's hand, then Natan Hashem Elokecha et kol ha'alot ha'eleh, then God will take all those curses, and then He will put it against your enemies, and then you will defeat them, and then we will come to that culmination. Two distinct processes. The Zohar says there is no defined time for when the last Galus will end. It will be dependent on Teshuvah, but that Teshuvah must happen irrespective. Either we will choose it, or unfortunately the circumstances of world history will make us recognize it. I heard a very powerful insight from Rabbi Reuven Leichter, and he said, if you look in human history, anti-Semitism or the attack against the destruction of the Jewish people, there was never a time where a plan was successfully executed and yet still failed. A successfully executed genocide against the Jewish people that was never successful except for what we just experienced in the last few months. You have to understand, how could it be that hundreds, if not thousands of missiles are shot indiscriminately into a population of innocent people? We have to look at that and say that there's a judgment taking place on the Jewish people at that time, because the plan is executed and there's no stopping of it. The bombs are going, and they should, according to the natural order of the world, be blowing up and completely destroying hundreds, if not thousands, of lives. And yet, what do we see? We see people on their rooftops watching fireworks shows. We see people just, wow, that's interesting, going about their lives. My parents were in Israel at the time. I was freaking out. And then they sent an email with a picture of them. They were all sitting in a restaurant in Jerusalem having like the greatest time. I'm like, what is going on here? There are missiles exploding, hundreds of them. Says Reb Leichter, he says, this is a message from God. He's saying there is a judgment which is taking place now. I'm forced to make you see this judgment. But I want you to know that I still love you, and I'm protecting you, and And I want you to recognize the hand of God, that despite the judgment, there is still a mercy that is saying, hey, listen, my children, what is necessary for us to do. So this is the time frame that we exist within. We must recognize this message because it is historically required. So I want to talk about what is a precursor to Teshuvah. What is the challenge that many of us have that prevents us from being able to actually make that step forward? So I want to point out one of the signs that the rabbis say is one of the simanim that the Talmud says will take place at the times of Mashiach. If you want to know, if you want to just observe the world and say, have we entered the stage of Mashiach, pre-Mashiach era? The Gemara says that there's one sign, very interesting. It says, at the times of pre-Mashiach times, chutzpah yazgeh. There will be a prevalence of audacity, of chutzpah in the world. People will be very disrespectful. People will not honor things that they should honor. And it will be prevalent across the world. Which unfortunately, if you speak to somebody who lived 20, 30, 40 years ago, ask them what's the difference between their life and the world today, they will see it as unbelievable how the world has changed, that there's a complete breakdown of honor and respect for anything which is of value. I'll just make this interesting point. My uncle once told me that when he was younger, he was a little kid, he said he was being like a little chutzpahdik to his father, and he looked him right in the eyes and he made like a face. My grandfather looked at my uncle and he told him, he said, I want you to know something. Never in my entire life did I ever look at my father in his eyes. How dare you stare at me like that? Now we have no concept of that. It doesn't mean not to look at your father in his eyes. But if we can appreciate that that happened, that life existed not long ago, we can appreciate the breakdown here. And says Rav Mandelbaum, he says, what is the essential ingredient that creates a generation of people which have no respect? He says it comes from a lack of self-respect. Meaning to say like this, when you see a young kid or an adult act disrespectfully to somebody older than them or someone more honorable than them, what you see there is an interesting thing. You see that there's two ways a person can gain their own dignity and self-respect. They can do it because they actualize their own potential and their own understanding of who they are. Or if a person's lacking that, if a person doesn't know who they are, doesn't appreciate what their position and status and contribution to the world is, where do they get their self-value? You get it by putting other people down. And therefore, if the Talmud is saying that we will enter a generation where chutzpah will be prevalent in all walks of life, then we have to recognize at the end of time, there will be a point in history where there will be such a lack of self-respect, self-value, self-recognition, and self-honor that will cause us to be in a very difficult predicament. And so this is our challenge. We've entered a time where it's necessary for us to think about our lives and think about what we do, but on the other hand, a person who has no self-value, self-respect, or self-worth, a person like that will always very easily tell him, what difference does it make what I do? I'm a nobody anyway. If I'm nobody, and if I'm just another cog in the wheel of this world, then who cares how I talk about other people? You think I'm going to make a difference? Who cares if I don't make these specific blessings before I eat? Who cares if I'm not on time for this shiur, for this prayer? When you don't respect yourself, you don't recognize that there's a failure and a breakdown in the things that you're supposed to do because you have no value. It's almost like saying, this might be a crude analogy, but imagine a guy's on death row and he starts gossiping about the guy in the next cell. So the warden walks over and says, come on, man, you should do better than that. How could you gossip about the person in the next cell? He's going to look at the warden, he's like, what are you, crazy? I'm on death row, man. You're talking to me about gossip? So we would all relate to that. But on a certain level, I think, we have to recognize that this is not a situation which is for that kid or that person. It's describing a state of being that we're all in. And that we all lack the true quality of what it means for us to be Jews in this time of a period. So I want to give a couple examples of how much of a breakdown there can be if people lack this very basic element of self-respect. The Shem Shmuel, who was one of the commentaries, lived recently in history, makes a very fascinating observation. He says that when Cain killed Hevel in the Parsha, in the beginning of the Torah, he says that Cain was only able to successfully kill Hevel because Hevel had a terribly low self-value for himself. I've never heard that before. A murder is a murder. What does one have to do with the other? Says the Shem Shmuel, why is his name called Hevel? Anybody know what the translation for the word Hevel is? Empty.
Empty.
Hevel. The Hevel. This is emptiness.
Nothing.
Why would the Torah, why was his name called Hevel? Says the Shem Shmuel, because Hevel did not recognize his individual contribution that he could have made. And when a person doesn't hold themselves of value, then they can very easily become victims to many, many other things. Right? We know that there is a person who's actually a victim, and then we know there are a type of people that make themselves into victims. He says this, it's interesting because when they brought the sacrifices, even though Hevel's sacrifice was accepted by God as being preferential, it says, V'Hevel gam hu, Hevi also brought a carbon. Gam hu means he didn't believe that you can connect. He didn't believe in his self-worth. Only when he saw his brother initiating, so then Hevel understood that that's what he has to do as well. The TORAH HaKadosh says also, he says that if you look in the Torah, the Psukim say a very interesting progression. The Jews were living in Goshen, they were prosperous, they were multiplying, they were growing, and then all of a sudden you see they become slaves in Egypt. A very strange, it's like you're talking about the kings of the world, the most respected and honorable people. How do you go from that quality to becoming slaves, the lowest of society? How do you do that transition? So he says, if you read the verses, it tells you exactly what happened. It says, Vayamat Yosef, and Yosef died, V'chol Achav, and all of his brothers, V'chol Hadorahu, and all of that generation. Says the TORAH HaKadosh, as long as the fathers were alive, and the dignity of the Jewish people was there, the Egyptians would never have been able to enslave the Jews. It's only after they lost their respect. They lost their own value. They said, well, who are we now? We don't have our great leaders, our great fathers. He says, when they lost that self-value and self-respect, then the Egyptians were able to capitalize on that weakness. And they were able to overcome them, and that's how the Jews became enslaved. Another fascinating midrash. I always understood that Levi, the tribe of Levi, were not enslaved in the slavery of Egypt. Right? We've all learned that. The midrash says actually it was Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. 3 tribes were not enslaved. The midrash says a very fascinating insight. It says, you know why those 3 specifically were not? I always thought it's because Levi were the Torah scholars, they were the great. I'm sure there's truth to that. I'm sure there is truth to that. But there's another angle the midrash says. The midrash says that when Yaakov Avinu was passing away and he had all of his sons gathered around his bed, and he gave them their blessings of how they will now continue in the world with a certain unique aspect of who they are, 3 of the sons, instead of getting blessings, they were chastised. Who were they? Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. And we know each for their own reasons, right? Shimon and Levi, because they attacked the city and they killed all the people, and Yaakov was very upset about that. And Reuven, because he switched the beds. And instead of them receiving an affirmation to their strength and their quality, they were chastised. Says the midrash, that low self-value permeated so deep into the psyche of those 3 tribes, says the midrash, that they were incapable of being enslaved in Egypt because they had such a low self-value that they would have just completely assimilated and lost themselves into history of the Egyptian people. And so to save them, God had to keep them outside. He says, you're not weak enough to go through these trials and tribulations. So we have to recognize that when there's a lack of self-understanding of who I am and what I can contribute, then everything can happen to us, and we won't even recognize because we won't care enough. But there's a real question that we have to ask on this foundation. So I'm trying to build up that yes, we have to have self-worth, we have to have self-respect, but what if a person is truly a failure? What if a person has truly messed up their life and made choices that they knew were wrong, but made those mistakes and failed and proved it? So you can't go to that person and say, you should believe in yourself, God loves you, but look at my track record, right? It might not be written in the prison record, but God knows exactly what I've done, where I've been, and what I've done. So how do we respond to that mindset, which many of us have, that we really have done wrong in our lives, or we continue to do wrong in our lives. I want to share with you a very, very powerful idea. You know, by the way, there's a question on Christian philosophy, which makes no sense in terms of Christianity believing that they have taken over the world mission from the Jews, right? They say they are the new chosen people, the new Jews, whatever that means. But it's very clear that they believe in the Old Testament, right? They never said that the Old Testament was not true. They said that the New Testament evolved out of the Old Testament. And now in the Old Testament, it doesn't say anywhere that God will relinquish his relationship or give up on the Jews. It doesn't say it anywhere. And at no point in history does he say that the laws will not be binding upon us. So why and how does Christianity accept that they are the new mission for God in the world? And the answer is because they just look at Jews throughout history. And they say, you guys have been tremendous failures. You've been in so many circumstances, and you've really, unfortunately, messed up in so many different ways. So they claim with logic, how could it be that God would ever accept you? You've really, unfortunately, done wrong, and the proof to it is the suffering that you've gone through. So they don't have a contextual proof, they take a historical proof. And what is our response to that? The response is, first of all, you have to look at the text of the Torah, and we know that it's not true. But even deeper, I want to share with you an idea of the Maharal. The Maharal says if you look at the leader, the father of all human history, of monotheism, which is Abraham, very strange thing you find is that we do not see that the Torah talks about any of his accomplishments prior to Lech Lecha. Lech Lecha, he's an older man, he's getting his prophecy at an older age, and now God is telling him about his new mission, about how he's supposed to contribute to being the leader of mankind. Why does the Torah not talk about how he became this person? He sacrificed his life, he was thrown around the world, people made fun of him. He was Avram HaIvri, he was on one side of the world and everyone was the other. He was thrown into fires. He went against the entire world. He converted cities of people. Why does the Torah not talk about the accomplishments of his life? Says the Maharal, a very, very powerful statement. He says, God specifically chose to begin the story of Avram Avinu without talking about his past, because God was teaching us that your past is irrelevant. Your past is irrelevant to God. So much so that you think it's because you're this and you've done this, or you've failed this way, or you've messed this up that way. God says, I don't look in the past. I always look to the future. And if you recognize that, you recognize that it's not because of our achievements or because of our failures that God chooses us today. It's because God knows that there's a greatness within each of us, and He will always believe in our ability to become better. That's the relevant point. This track record, for all intents and purposes, it doesn't exist as long as our focus is onward. And this is a very important point that we have to recognize. A person with a low self-value is constantly bombarded with the thoughts of, look what I've done. Look at my path. Look at my habits. Look at the way I am. Look at the way I relate to people. Look at my relationships. I have a terrible, I'm very jealous, or I'm a very angry person, or I'm this way, or I'm that way. We define ourselves by the certain qualities and character traits that we've become so accustomed to, and we take that as a litmus test for what needs to be in the future. God tells us by Avraham Avinu, no, that's a big mistake. If you don't move forward, it's your choice. It's not because there's anything that I hold against you as a grudge. And it goes even further than that. It goes even further than that. This chiddush. I would not have believed such a thing would ever been written, wouldn't ever have been written, unless I saw it inside. And it's the words of the Rambam. Rambam writes in Moreh Nevuchim, which is his philosophical work. He writes a very, very surprising statement. I'm going to read it to you and translate, so everybody gets his words and size. He says, "V'kasher chakarnu divrei chachamim b'zman ha'bezeh ha'inyan." When I evaluated with the wisest of people on this concept, nimtza lehem, we came to understand shehamitaveh la'averot, a person who desires sinful things, v'nichsaf aleim, and he's drawn to them very powerfully. Says the Rambam, hu yoter chashuv, that is an indication of a more honorable person. V'yoter shalem, and he has a capacity for shlemut, for completeness. Me'asher lo yit'aver, more than a person who does not have those desires. Alehen. V'lo yitzta'er banachatam, and to a person who doesn't have pain when he doesn't commit those things. Ad she'amru, says the Rambam, until they've said the bold statement, Shekol asher yihyeh ha'adam yoter chashuv. If you want to know who is a truly great person internally, yoter shakol adam yoter chashuv veyoter shalem, and more complete, tihiyeh chukato, his desire la'averot, for sin, v'tzta'aro banachatan, and his pain of not committing them, yoter gdolot, they will be much greater than other people. Ve'eviu bezeh hadvarim v'amru, and he says, I will quote you a verse. It says, a statement, Kol hagadol mechavero, a person who is greater than his friend, Yitzro gadol hamenu, which says that exactly the reasons we would believe we are failures, says the Torah, says the Rambam, I want you to know, there's an indication here of a quality of greatness that you don't know. The same pain that draws us down because of our weaknesses, and we look at other people and say, well, they don't do this, God must love them more than he loves us. Says the Rambam, no. They don't have that pain because they have a less capacity for greatness than you do. If you suffer that pain, that you just love to talk about other people, or you just love going to places where you shouldn't, or buying things you shouldn't, that compromise your values, your Torah. You love getting into fights. You love proving your spouse wrong. Oh, love that joy when I just prove them wrong. They can't get me back, right? There's a joy in that. We think we're sadistic. Says the Rambam, no, that's an indication that you're great. Recognize that greatness, and that will propel a person to understand that they can do much more in their future. So now this transition, I want to transition into Teshuvah. Because there's a fundamental question based on what I'm saying. We know that there are three aspects of Teshuvah that have to be done. A person has to admit, vidui, you have to admit that you sinned, confession, charata, you have to have genuine regret for what you did, the Kabbalah Latid, and you have to make a commitment to the future to move away from that activity. The question is on charata, regret. If an elemental or a fundamental part of Teshuvah is regret of my past, then really God is telling you, you have to feel like you're a failure in a certain way. If I have to feel the emotional pain of what I've done wrong, then I have to acknowledge that I failed. And the more pain I feel about that past, then the more real my Teshuvah will be. And so how do we balance the requirement to recognize that I'm great and live in a positive light, but at the same time live with deep regret about my past? It seems like a contradiction, but it's an element of Teshuvah that we must overcome. So says Reb Mandelbaum, beautiful idea. There's two ways a person can have regret about their past. One can be a depressive regret, and another one which is a much healthier regret. And that is by saying, I'm much better than that. One is recognizing your greatness and then saying, a person like me shouldn't have done those types of things. As opposed to a person saying, well, that's good for a person like me because I'm a nobody anyway. One motivates a person forward and one draws a person back. Depression and sadness is nowhere included in the whole discussion of Teshuvah. If it does, then you're making a mistake. Why? Because when a person gets sad or depressed, has anybody ever failed miserably in something, and then after that, they just do it again because they're like, it doesn't matter anyway, I'm a loser, I'm a nobody. I know I have. We mess up bad, we do something really bad, and then after that, we compromise on other things because we know we're nobodies. Save the rabbis. If you think that regret has to do with feeling depressed about your past, that makes no sense because it only leads you to do more sin. Regret is recognizing that I'm much better than that. What do we tell kids? What do we try to positively motivate? What do teachers say? Like in the report card, we expect more from this person, right? So if you see that, either you should be really afraid, or a genuine teacher, you're going to be really proud. Because if you say, I expect more from you, and you deal with people in a way that gives them honor for who they are, then they will live up to that standard. It motivates you to become better as opposed to dragging you back. So, if this is the truth of history, we recognize that our own shortcomings are our own vices, but they are not mandated by God and they should not be holding us back. Are there motivators that we can think about when we enter this time, in this time period of Elul, that can help us think a little bit more about stepping up to make the changes that we want to? So I was just thinking, two came to mind. If we do recognize that we are so close to the end of time, that this is it, that all of the past and all of the travels and all of the pain and all of the successes and all of the travels of histories of your grandparents and your great-grandparents and your Ada and your community, everything, the suffering, the traveling, everything has now come to us. And the world history is looking down on us from Shemayim, and they're looking to see, what are you guys going to do with all of our history? We would recognize a very strong responsibility that is upon us. We cannot look and say, I'm just one person, one individual, it doesn't matter. No, that's wrong. If we live today, that means that we have succeeded in overcoming pogroms, assimilation, and suffering. If you sit in this room today, it means that somewhere back in your history, somebody made a great sacrifice. It has to be, because if that sacrifice did not take place, you wouldn't be here today. Like the 80% of assimilation that always takes place, or the 75% that takes place historically. We are the living legacy of people who have made great sacrifices. That is a very strong burden of responsibility that we have to take forward with us. And if we recognize that our time is limited, even in a personal level, we often think life will be forever. We think that everything will come to an end. We'll enjoy it now, but it will continue. It reminds me of a story once. I was when I was in yeshiva before I was married. We used to go every so often to visit the hospitals. We used to visit people, cheer them up. Unfortunately, they're in bad circumstances. So I remember walking into a room, and there was an older lady, and she was in her bed, and she was crying. Really, it was really sad. You don't usually walk into a room and see somebody really crying. You have to talk to them for a few minutes, and then they start crying, right? But I walked in, she was just crying, and so we went over to her, trying to cheer her up. And she starts talking to her, she says, boys, I'm not going to be able to act it out as she did, but boys, I lived such a good life. She's still crying. She says, I traveled the entire world. I danced with so many people. I met the most amazing people. I ate the greatest foods. I did everything you could imagine. And she's crying. I'm like, what's wrong with her? Did they give her a dose of medication? And she looks and she says, but I have nothing to say for all of that. And she says, I've come to that recognition that I didn't make anything of my life. That's something worth crying about. Something worth crying about is recognizing that when we're not making valuable contributions to go against our base nature, if we're constantly doing what's convenient, always, chesed comes up, it's inconvenient, and we'll always have excuses. Opportunity to grow and change happens, it's inconvenient right now, there's too much going on in my life. There will always be excuses and distractions. It's inevitable. It says in Mesilat Yesharim, that is the nature of the world. If we're constantly giving in to those excuses, one day, God forbid, we will wake up, that old man or an old lady, and we will say, we ate good foods on Shabbat. We bought nice clothing. We drove fancy cars. But what do I have to say for it? Life ticks. It goes. A motivating factor to step up to do what we need to do is recognize that our life is limited and that there is a time and accounting for it. And I just want to review and end with a point. So we started with a question. We know that there's an individual imperative to do Teshuvah. That happens every year. We have also shown that there is a historical imperative for Teshuvah. There's a responsibility now. We've transitioned out of Parsha Ki Tavo, which is the suffering that we experienced as our people in the last generation. Now we've transitioned into the 800th year of human history. When we open the Torah and we look inside, what is mandated at this time? V'shavda ad Hashem Elokecha. Jewish people, recognize what's happened in your past and make commitments forward. There will be two ways this can happen, God says. It has to be through Teshuvah. It will be either self-motivated, or unfortunately, I will have to do things to help you open your eyes and see it yourself. Nobody likes when a little kid's arm is twisted and forces him to say sorry to the other kid that he just hit. He'll say sorry, he will. But it's much better if a person recognizes that I need to apologize because what I've done is wrong. This is where we are today. This is our point in history. The world is looking down on us and saying, what will you make of our past? Don't look at your life as a nothing. If we recognize that chutzpah will be existent in the last generation because we have a weak sense of self, and our identity comes from how we look at others, how we put others down, or how we think we are better than others. I might not put people down, but if I'm always looking that I'm confident with myself because, well, you know what they do or what he does, I'm much better than that. Trust me, you'll always find somebody who's doing less than you. And you can find satisfaction in that, but that doesn't motivate a person to grow. That's an indication of a person who doesn't understand their self-value or what they have to contribute. What if I have true failures in the past? What if I really have bad slate? Says the Torah, that's irrelevant to me. I need you to look onward. Just like Avraham Avinu's life was not based on his accomplishments of the past, it was irrelevant what he did. God says, I choose you now because of what you do going forward. And every Jew has a responsibility to recognize that despite who I've been, what I've done, or what I am doing right now, if I choose to change my view of myself, of my people around me, of how I interact, of how I commit myself to my Torah, my study, my Judaism, then God says that's exactly what I want. To the point where, when we see we have strong emotional desire or feeling towards doing things that we know are wrong, the Rambam tells us that's an indication of a greatness that you have within you. It's not an indication of a failure. Because if you didn't have that, you would be less great in the eyes of God. How do we motivate ourselves to do that? Think about that lady on the bed. I was traveling, we were in Miami visiting my parents, and we went to Parrot Jungle. If you've ever been there, it's a nice little amusement park with animals. And we were at one of the, I think it was a parrot show, and everyone was watching the show, but something caught my eye, and I think I was watching a couple more than I was watching the show. And I saw this couple with two small kids. They were sitting very close to each other, and they had kids, but there was a certain warmth that existed within this couple that I observed that it was a little bit odd, because you don't usually see that within married couples with kids. I made this observation because I noticed that the husband was completely bald, and he had no hair on his eyebrows, or on his head, or anywhere on his body. And I realized that this man is likely suffering from cancer. And he's probably on this vacation with his family, recognizing this is the truly most important thing in my life. And I was watching them, and I was watching everybody else. And there was clearly something unique about that relationship that we didn't see anywhere else. We all have our hair, Baruch Hashem, in our eyes, in our health. We don't need to see the suffering that will force us to see the realities, to recognize of the blessing that exists within each of our lives, right in front of us. You have to be a little bit morbid at times, but you have to almost think, God forbid, what if I was in a situation where it was limited, or I didn't see how much longer I had in this life? All of a sudden our perspective on everything would change. It would motivate us to bring that greatness that we have out of ourselves. I'll just end with one thought. I mentioned before, the Midrash says that Reuven, Shimon, and Levi were not enslaved in Egypt because they didn't believe in their own qualities of greatness. They would have succumbed to the challenges of Egypt, and they would have completely disappeared from world history. But what does it say about all the other tribes? All the other tribes did go to Egypt. And all the other tribes did suffer the pain, the suffering, the wealth, the challenges. All of the challenges that we would have thought a person cannot overcome, we learn a tremendous lesson. That if God put them in that situation, it was proof to the fact that they had the ability to overcome the challenge. Because if not, they wouldn't have been put in that time in history. And that's a very telling statement for all of us in our lives. Despite the circumstances of our lives, the challenges, the circumstances, the difficulties, the anxieties, the pain, the challenges, the health, doesn't matter what it is. If we were placed in that circumstance at this point in time, in this point in history, it's a proof that God believes that we have a capacity to overcome. Because if not, we would have existed at some other point in history, some other place, at some other time, without the same challenges. there's a responsibility we have as people to look at those circumstances not as debilitating obstacles, but they are opportunities for us to recognize that if I can get through this pickle, this challenge about my life, the things that prevent me from becoming a better person, if I can see past them and through it, that is the blessing that God guarantees for us. And God willing, we should see this blessing, and we should motivate ourselves. If we do it, it has a trickle effect on the people around us. If we start acting better, they will do more, and God willing, we will create a change that will take place to the extent where God will say, you have motivated this growth and this change, and therefore I will be motivated myself to bring you back into Israel with Mashiach. Thank you for listening.